Well, welcome everybody. Special welcome to President Walker, who's here, which is great, who has an incredible, rich, deep background in media. So we'll be looking to her if it gets quiet at all for any questions. No pressure, Professor. And tonight we have Professor Grzinski with us from the University of Vermont, who is part of their political science faculty, who has been looking at issues of media and politics and democracy really for his entire career. And we're so pleased to have him with us. He and I, as usual, are going to start with a little bit of a conversation, a little bit of chat, and then we'll open it up to all of you and everybody who's watching online to add to the conversation, to ask questions, and to be a part of what I'm sure will be a lively minute. And just a reminder, friendly reminder to those of you who are required to be here and taking it for a class, hands up, ask questions. You know, we welcome / require your participation.
Wow.
So Jack,
you forced them to.
Yeah. Thanks for being with us. We're really excited.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. I'd love to have this opportunity to talk about politics, democracy, media.
Great.
Yeah.
Let me grab this mic, actually. So when Jack and I were talking a little bit over supper tonight, we're talking about he's been on sabbatical, so he hasn't been in the classroom for a little while. I thought we might start by talking about what you've been up to. You said you were doing some writing and some research. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. My research agenda has changed quite a bit over the years. I focus a lot on elections and campaign finance and political parties. And in recent years, I shifted into another area I've always been quite interested in, and that is the media. I teach a course, I have been since 1993, on media and politics at UVM. And I also, a spin-off course, a senior seminar on the political effects of entertainment media, looking at how entertainment media might actually shape our views about politics. This sabbatical, I have 3 projects I'm working on. One is a project I'm continuing with our honors students. We're doing a little research project from their final class they had with me. It was interrupted by me getting COVID last spring, but we're looking into the effects of the HBO show Euphoria on attitudes about drug policy.
Has anybody seen that, just out of curiosity? Okay.
Supposedly pretty popular among 18 to 25-year-olds. That's kind of what we're looking at. I've watched just a handful of the show, and it's not for me. But anyway, but it's fascinating in terms of the potential effects it could have. My last book was called The Political Effects of Entertainment Media, and I am working on expanding a theory explaining or discussing why we would expect entertainment media to have an impact on how we see politics. And it borrows heavily from psychology, communications, and political science. And so I'm working on that with a grad student in communications. And the big project I'm working on, however, is a book on media and democracy. Last time I taught my media class, I really decided to just tie it, directly into the state of democracy and what we're seeing right now. Had wonderful conversations with my students about it, and decided that that's a really good framework for talking about media in the US, especially given how much media changes day to day, how rapidly it changes, that it's, the standard textbooks about media just don't cut it, and they're out of date like in 2 years. And in this book, I'm trying to go at it from a perspective, all right, we're in a certain state as far as democracy is concerned. It's a very frightening state. A lot of political scientists are incredibly concerned about it. There's actually this organization that polls political scientists around the world on the state of democracy, including that in the United States. I just filled out my form of it today, and you can see the concern among those of us scholars who study our political system, how concerned we are about it and how worried, especially coming into this election, in this midterm election and the following presidential election about the state of things. And so I thought that was a good jumping off point to discuss media, the more broadly media system, and what the media system contributes to the information environment, which is part of a really huge part of the source of the problems we're having with democracy right now. So I should shut up there. If I could just run on and on.
And I would like
That's
to
because
run
I
on.
haven't been teaching for a while. Sorry.
But just to pause for a minute, when you say media, tell us what you mean by media when you're thinking about it.
So earlier versions of the book, this book I had been working on before I jumped and did my last book. I kind of shoved this one aside. It was called The End of the Media, because talking about the media is something we can't really talk about anymore. There is no one media. And so I've shifted over to say, and people who study this, to calling it media system, all right? To recognize all the various components in the media system, from the traditional media outlets, journalism, but also the newer outlets on internet, cable, things like YouTube, and then social media, the computer mediated communications system, as the communication scholars call it, that has allowed everybody to get their voices into the system as well. And that's why I decided to sort of think about it more, step back and say, well, let's look at the information environment first, all the messages that are out there that affect our views about politics, and then start taking a look at what components of the media system contribute and in what ways to that information environment, which I'm arguing is incredibly polluted at the moment, if you would. And what role do different media aspects of the media system contribute to polluting that information environment, if you would.
So what sorts of things are you seeing? What exactly are you learning?
This is this piece, as far as this book is concerned. I guess some of the more specific things are, if we just think about that information environment, what are some of the key characteristics of what is out there that people are consuming? There's obviously an awful lot of misinformation and disinformation these days in our system, and that is overwhelming the good information, the good that follows the principles of journalism. Sorry, since you mentioned that, I'm gonna keep looking at you every time I talk about journalism. So there's that misinformation, disinformation. There's a conveyance of attitude about politics, a high level of cynicism about politicians, about politics, about the political system, about elections. One of my previous books was about the election system, the problems in our election system, and identifying the fact that it was in a very precarious position before Trump even came along. And part of that was that we as a citizenry have an awful lot of cynicism about politics, and that cynicism, and I'm talking about, dismissing views you don't agree with, not trusting or believing anyone, not being able to have an argument over facts and evidence, just thinking that all that is just manipulated by people's political positions, that everybody has a bias and you can't trust what anyone says, because their bias is going to be manipulating that. So there's
that's
that.
Not new.
No, that's not new. Yeah, all of this is kind of this is more of a kind of historical how we built up to this point. So that cynicism is problematic. You want your citizens to be skeptical, but you don't want them to be cynical. So disinformation, there's a lot of this you are all well aware of, I'm sure, the nastiness that has come into our political discourse, the kind of vitriol, the divisiveness that has led to a much more polarized nation. And one of the things scholars who study democracy are concerned about is how polarized society becomes, and that's a lead up to losing your democracy. And as you probably well know, we are incredibly polarized in ways that, there's a certain type of polarization that's actually good. That is, if if the parties in government are polarized in their ideology and their policy, that gives voters a choice. But when polarization becomes a reason to have animosity, that it becomes kind of a tribal identification with a group, and a reason for, and what scholars have found is that partisanship these days is more about your disdain and dislike and even hatred for those on the other side than it is about any identification with members in your group in a way. And so there's an awful lot of that in our discourse. And, obviously as I go through these things, you might start thinking, oh yeah, well, you think about our media and how our media might have contributed to that. Our for-profit media gives voice to individuals who are the most outrageous and most extreme. So they really kind of fuel that sort of things. There's a great book called The Outrage Industry that I used last time I taught my class on media that really demonstrates how that drive for profit really led to promoting that kind of outrage and anger that has really filled our information environment without all that kind of animosity. Those are, all right, I'm forgetting some of the other ones. Sorry. Danger of doing things without notes.
No.
Those are key aspects of it. I think that's good enough to get us
Yeah.
started, and the others will pop back in my head as we talk.
So I just want to go back. So when you said that it's good for there to be sort of real distinction between two parties, Democrats, Republicans. I mean, we certainly have that right now, but it
More
feels,
than we've had in a long
but it
time.
feels right. It feels different. So we have it, and so people are choosing. But what else is happening there that's causing, the divisiveness, the skepticism, if you will?
Yeah, it's one of those beware of what you want, for you may get it, because political scientists for a long time have been arguing, well, if you could have a really vibrant democracy if you had at least two parties that clearly differentiated themselves on the direction they wanted to take government. That gives the voters a clear choice, right? And that empowers voters because they can see what happens when they choose, one of the parties, and that party implements those policies. And one of the myths about politicians and politics, Brian, I love this, is that they don't keep their promises. Political scientists have demonstrated that they actually do, but the public thinks they don't. That's part of the cynicism. Political
Except
parties.
the paper you wrote on Brian Campion, the state senator. Honesty at its best.
Even the political parties, people in our country, and other systems use political parties differently than we do. They actually represent a very good voting queue that what you will get, in terms of a wide swath of policies. And if you were to vote those ways, you might not be as unhappy as, say, someone, going back to a conversation we had earlier, didn't vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and now is upset about the Supreme Court overturning of the Roe versus Wade precedent on abortion issue. Those kind of things, how did we get off on that?
Well, I was just talking, in a way, what you just were describing, it sounded like we have this ideal situation.
Oh, yeah.
We do have these two parties that are very.
Why is it bad?
Why is it so bad right now?
Part of that is the stakes all get so high.
Yeah.
Anyway, political scientists for a long time are pushing to have this kind of divide to help empower voters. But we didn't expect it to get as nasty as it got. And to a certain degree, that has to deal with the stakes in the game when policy is clearly divided and what that means if you lose power. So, Mitch McConnell's maneuverings with the Supreme Court, that's a raw exercise of power, and a lot was at stake for their policy, their ideology, if you would. And so that makes them push the boundaries of the norms of democracy in terms of that. How many of you are you aware of the book, How Democracies Die by yeah. So what, the norms are mutual tolerance of those who disagree with you, which is broken down, and sort of an institutional forbearance where you don't use your power to the full extent, those two key norms. And when the stakes are high, McConnell's like, I don't care if I'm inconsistent, this is too important to give up the Supreme Court appointment. So that's part of it, but also our culture, that's where the media comes in, or certain aspects of media come in, that reward the animosity between the parties and reward that kind of rhetoric as opposed to the arguments more based on policy. Arguments based on policy are boring. That, for-profit media organizations aren't going to keep their audience by having in-depth policy discussions. They're going to keep it, they get, two crazy on the right and a crazy person on the left and have them yell at each other. And that's kind of the model of, a lot of the for-profit media, or the outrage industry, where you get a crazy behind the mic who just spouts ridiculous stuff and keeps a large audience and makes a huge profit. So that's where the media system comes in, shifts the discourse, if you would, and helps to make it a lot nastier. You add social media into the mix then. Sorry, Susan.
So the way you're just describing that, then, have you learned that in the media system, like emotional response is more attractive or popular or engaging for a public?
More likely to get,
than like you were saying, a discussion about policy. But if that were really the case, and that we know that humans respond more to an emotional draw, of engagement, then why wouldn't the media, and this gets into, does the media have ethics? Do they have responsibility? Or are they just reporting whatever, because like you said, the for-profits, emotion draws people. But why wouldn't then you coach or talk to people who would do policy and create policy conversations that are really emotional and really engaging, that pull people in, but it's about the content is policy?
Remind me if I forget that second part of the question. The first part of the question is, you separate out journalists from media organizations. They're not the same. They have different incentives. So professional journalists who see themselves as professionals, now I feel like, watch. Journalists as a profession, they even got together, it's now House of Pew Research, but it was a committee for, the committee for, ethics in journalism, something along those lines. They put together a study where they went around and interviewed journalists about their principles of their job and how they view their job. They also interviewed public and political elite to try to get a sense, well, what do you want out of journalism? And so journalists, trained in journalism schools, follow a set of principles of trying to get as accurate a picture of reality to report, to the public, and see themselves as, committed to citizens first. I think that's actually the first point in the principles of journalism, committed to citizens first and informing citizens first. But journalists don't work for themselves. And that's where the difference is. And that's, talking about the media system, you have to think about, all right, all these different organizations that employ journalists. Some of them, based upon their audience, have to push certain types of content that overrides the principles that journalists stand by. And so journalists may not want to work at those organizations. They might not have a choice in terms of working at those types of organizations. But the idea is that to make a profit, you need to produce entertainment for your audience to keep your audience. And that makes it so that journalists' principles are not the first thing that determines the content of media organizations.
But does that mean that entertainment can never equate with professional journalism or ethical? That's what I'm trying to connect.
You have to be careful. Yeah.
Completely disconnected. Like emotion goes to the negative, like
emotion,
the worst part of ourselves, as opposed to couldn't it be framed that you engage emotionally with like real content.
And emotion is important. Emotion is important for politics, right? You need to be passionate, but it needs to be balanced by the reason and evidence. And there's one book I've used in teaching my media class since 1993 is a book by Neil Postman called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And in recent years, people have gone back and said, wow, Postman really got it. And Postman basically predicted our current nonsensical discourse right now and the breakdown in reason in our society and our culture by the fact, and in his writing, there's a lesson about, entertainment and informing or knowledge, right? You have to be careful in terms of pushing the entertainment side of things in a number of different aspects. One is that if you make it too entertaining, people don't take it seriously. So if you go too far, then people just dismiss it. So he was talking back then in his book, he was writing about how the medium of television itself it's a medium for the purpose of entertainment. It's designed to entertain, not to inform. And we lost sight of that. And because of it, and because it became our dominant medium, it changed our culture to expect everything to be entertaining and to break down reason discourse into television style discourse, which is fragmented, without context, without background, where contradiction doesn't matter. It's not reasoned. And that's how television presents things, atomized pictures of the world that aren't connected to anything else, that don't lead to any logical conclusion about how the world works. You kind of have to give that yourself. So that television just presents the world as this atomized bunch of trivia that really then overwhelms people. And
even in the news outlets.
Even in the news outlets. And especially in the news outlets. And his argument is serious television is an oxymoron because you try to be serious. If you push it too far, you lose your audience. If you go entertain too much, then you make it so that it's the meta message is it's not to be taken seriously.
Do you mind if I do a question? Are you good right now?
No, I'm good.
Okay, all right.
Sorry, I hope that answered
No.
those questions.
I mean, just based on, I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on the political comedy as a genre.
Interesting. I actually did some research on that. And there's different types of political comedy. Some other people have written books on it, but I have 2 chapters or 1 chapter in my previous book on The Daily Show and The Colbert Report when Jon Stewart did The Daily Show, and how they differ from things like late night comedy. And others had pointed this out. There's actually a scholar who wrote a really good book, if you're interested in that, called From Cronkite to Colbert. His last name is Bayme, B-A-Y-M-E. Basically, and I had done some work with my students before we came to this piece, not all political comedy is the same. And the interesting thing about what Stewart and Colbert were doing in their shows is they were actually modeling a type of skepticism, not a type of cynicism. And they were, above all else, as Bayme writes, they were spoofing the form of media of television as being nonsensical and incapable of actually having serious discourse. You even to the point where I think Howard Dean was on Stephen Colbert one time, and he's like, in 3 seconds, tell me this. And, just embedded in that comment is a mockery of television. How can you really have informed discourse if you're limited to so few seconds and just that kind of reaction? And it was wonderful how they mocked all of the conventions of television news and how dramatic they were, and the senior correspondent of this or that. And Bayme argued that, they were doing a good service, and that's different from the late night comedians who were just more cynical about politics and just making fun of the foibles of politicians, as opposed to pointing out in a satirical way the problems with the political system or the problems with the media. And anyway, I did a host of studies with my students on that. And what we had to do, it's kind of interesting. Political science for a long time had been using this one standard question to measure trust. Sorry, I'll get to you in a moment. To measure trust among people. And that was also used as a measure of cynicism, but it really didn't tease out that difference between cynicism and skepticism. And so we had to devise a survey question to try to tease out people who are more skeptical versus those who are more cynical. And we struggled with it for a while until I had a conversation with a friend, a guy who plays baseball with me at a bar, and he was incredibly cynical. And he just kept kind of repeating the same thing over again. And like, it doesn't matter what facts or evidence are, people just manipulate it all. You can't ever really get to the truth, was his point. And so I wrote that up into a question and then devised the alternative to it, which would be the skeptical answer. And then we surveyed people and measured how much exposure they had to the Daily Show and Colbert Report. And we found that indeed those who watched the Daily Show and Colbert Report were higher on the skepticism measure and lower on the cynicism measure, and vice versa. So that we couldn't prove causation because it was a survey. But it is interesting to note that the same kind of audience who might view, say, House of Cards, if you look at the audience, of House of Cards and use the same measures, they were like off the scale on cynicism and low on skepticism. And so, nuanced answer, and in Postman's book, sorry, I hope I don't run on too long on these, but in Postman's book, he complains in his last chapter that the editor was pushing him to come up with solutions to the problem he identified for television. And he said, well, one possibility might be satire shows that make fun of the form of television, like Saturday Night Live. But he was kind of skeptical that would work because that would, they would end up becoming celebrities and then people would just be laughing about it and not really thinking about it. But I think what we found is that, and what Bain argues as well in his book, that maybe that wasn't the case for Colbert and Stewart during those times, that actually it had a positive effect on people. I know my students are like, the only way I can take the news today is watch it on comedy shows. My 16-year-old is the same way, I think. Sorry.
Do you feel like a follow-up or are you good? Okay, great, yeah.
When you were talking, I couldn't help thinking about something I heard on Ralph Nader Radio Hour recently, where Nader says that there's more, he bemoans that there's more expose documentaries than ever before, that we actually have an abundance of
Nobody watches
whistleblower type of media, but yet because television is so endlessly fragmented through streaming platforms, the audience is predetermined, as opposed to 40 years ago, where it was network television and actually the whole country might have watched one show.
That's another aspect of that. Is it okay if I answer that before I get to your question?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Questions.
Okay,
Yeah.
and we can jump back to that.
Yeah.
An aspect of our media system is that fragmentation as well. And that also feeds that polarization, as you point out, because people can select their own news outlets to fit whatever their views are or their social grouping or things along those lines. And so that definitely plays a role in that. And that leads to the other area I'm doing research on that I think is fascinating if you think about it, and that is the persuasive effects of entertainment media, pure entertainment media, that is that which people just watch for fun. And whether people select that on political content, I make an argument in my last book that they can't really do that because you can't be aware of all the different ways that entertainment media can shape your views about politics. And you're just going into it for fun. And in psychology, there's a whole theory called narrative transportation theory that argues when we're immersed in a story, our minds work in a very different way than we're listening to someone persuade us. You know, we're engaged rationally on the information that we have when we're being involved in watching the news or listening to a debate or something like this. But when you're reading a story, your mind is in a completely different state. Okay. Your mind, all the energy of your mind is devoted to imagining that world, being in that world, being present in that world, identifying with the characters in that world. And because of that, entertainment media actually, this is why I bring this up to that point, to Nader's point, is that that might actually be an avenue where you could reach people more easily in our current media environment than you can through news and informational shows. And in fact, countries have experimented with this with soap operas to try to get over ethnic hatreds, and it's worked, you know. And so I've done work. I did a book called Harry Potter and the Millennials, which I did some projects with my students about.
Which we will talk about, since everybody
Yeah.
tells me I've got to ask
Sure.
you a couple questions about it.
Anyway, if you're fans of the Harry Potter series or know a little bit about it, there are these lessons. There are ways the characters act and lessons in the series. Plus, for the millennials, they were growing up with the characters, so they identified really closely. They dressed up as the characters. And if you're doing that, you're likely to emulate the values that those characters show in the narrative or the story. And, you know, if you think about the lessons that just pop up over and over again in the series, there's the acceptance of diversity and differences in people. Harry always does that, right? And his friends do that, the bad guys don't. There's kind of a level of political tolerance that everybody should have the same rights. So, you know, the people who are on Voldemort's side don't want magical creatures to carry wands, all that kind of thing, you know, all those equality issues. There's attitudes about authority and authoritarianism. And one of my colleagues followed up on this piece and found additional supportive evidence that there's you guys understand or have heard about the notion of authoritarianism. That's kind of an attitude about authority in society where you're really deferential to those above you, and you know, below you think of people as beneath you. You want to see people adhere to kind of certain set of norms and conform to those norms in society. You're much more about following that kind of authority in your society, as opposed to challenging that, the more democratic view and questioning authority that, say, Harry and his friends did in the series. And political scientists, actually one of my former mentor from grad school, developed this great new measure of authoritarianism that captures it on both the left and the right. There's a problem with the earlier measures that just got right-wing authoritarianism, but didn't measure left-wing authoritarianism as well. But, you know, the lesson in the book is don't be an authoritarian kid. That was my heading for the section in the book.
I'm just curious, does that resonate with any of you? I mean, as having grown up with Harry Potter a little bit?
Kind of that anti-authoritarianism. One of my colleagues at University of Pennsylvania, actually, then in the 2016 election, did a study where she found that the number of books, Harry Potter books you read, was an incredibly high level predictor of your support for Donald Trump and for authoritarianism because of Donald Trump's authoritarian nature. Anyway, there's attitudes about violence and torture as well in the book. And we found, you know, that Harry Potter fans on all those lessons, they seem to really pick them up. Those who weren't fans didn't. And then other scholars came along, a group of European scholars did an experiment to get at the causal relationship here that we couldn't do in the survey. But anyway, so going back to the whole Ralph Nader thing, sorry, I am like spinning off big time on tangents.
That extra cup of coffee.
Yeah, and the chocolate cake.
Chocolate cake.
Sorry, and not teaching. It's also, sorry, like over summertime, I play baseball. I'm with my 16-year-old for like the whole week, and I'm not talking to any adult. I go to the baseball game and I'm like talking to all my teammates, and I can't shut up like I'm doing right now. But anyway, entertainment media in this fractured environment offers an interesting possibility of bringing people together more, because people tend to select it for reasons that aren't necessarily due to their politics, unless they know, like if it's a documentary, they're not going to watch it. But if it's the new Avatar movie, they're not thinking about politics, you know, or the new MCU movie.
But the new Avatar movie, they're worried about the China market, so they're not going to make it anyways.
Yeah, that all comes into the whole, you know, factors that affect the product that the media produces big time. Yeah. But anyway, did that address your, I actually had a call from Ralph Nader many years ago. I went to, he gave a talk like shortly after he ran in 1996. And I was quizzing him skeptically with some questions during this event. Anyway, there's some other history, including with Philip Ruth, another senator who's a friend of mine, about this whole Ralph Nader costing Al Gore the 2000 election. One of my students got in an argument with another student about it, and with another faculty member in the English department, and she attacked our department as for training Nazis. I had a conservative member of the department who she was talking about. She really hated at that point in time, but all of this kind of Ralph Nader thing. So it was kind of going around. People are aware, sort of aware of this. And like 2 days after this exchange between the student of mine and this faculty, I get a call, and it's like, you know, this is actually Ralph Nader's secretary. As you talk to Ralph Nader, would like to talk to you. And I was like, okay, and put him on. And my immediate thought was, he said, this is Ralph Nader calling. And I was like, I actually said, yeah, right. And I thought it was Philip Ruth doing an imitation because of the whole story. But he actually bought a chunk of my book, Money Rules, because he liked the book on campaign finance and sold it on his site. So I felt bad for kind of the whole thing. Anyway, sorry, story tangent.
Okay, so I was wondering what you think of sort of lesser media figures. I'm thinking specifically of the work that Romance has done in raising money for democracy, raising money for Stacey Abrams in particular. What do you think of like not television people doing this, using their platforms to work towards?
So celebrities, sorry, I didn't catch who you said at the first point.
I was talking particularly about romance authors and their work with Stacey Abrams. History also got together and raised a bunch of money after Romance raised like a whole.
They're all citizens, so I have no problem with their activism.
No,
Yeah.
but like in terms of like a genre, like using their platform, using their.
You mean like it informs their future books?
Like book talk? No,
Sorry.
No, I think you mean
I
they're like
guess
the
you don't know
political.
what I'm talking about, and therefore it's like.
No, keep going. Yeah, keep explaining.
Okay, so a bunch of romance authors got together and did an auction for the
Get out the vote, the mobilization program that Stacey Abrams, no. Okay.
No, that was when Stacey Abrams ran for governor, they did a separate one. They raised a whole bunch of money. And I'm just wondering what you think of people in the media using their social platforms to raise money, to do activism in such a way.
I don't see a problem with that. I think when you take, there's a whole issue of, it depends on whether they're posing as experts about something, as opposed to just they're activists, they're fellow citizens who are raising money for other politicians. And I don't think there's a problem with that side of it. I don't know if that answers your question. There is this, the social media influencers, and the celebrities who, if they speak as though they are authorities on a subject, that's where you run into a problem, because they aren't experts necessarily on a particular thing, but because they're celebrities and people like them, they're likely to listen to them, even though they may contradict all of the experts in a field. We've seen that with I forgot who the author was who didn't believe in climate change, and so people are like, oh, he doesn't believe in climate change, I'm going to go with that, despite the fact 99% of all the scientists who study that area is like, no, it's real and humans are contributing to it, kind of thing. So it does bring up there's kind of that interesting celebrity or just media people and the role they play. So there are different ways they can do different aspects. Celebrities have raised money for politicians for a long time. Politicians go to California and Los Angeles for one reason. They don't need to win California in terms of the Electoral College. They need to get the money out of all the wealthy people there. That's part of that brings up the issue of campaign finance, which there's one issue of helping people raise money. There's another, using your wealth as leverage to get political power. Was that what you were going for? Or?
Yeah, did you get a sense of whether or not those novelists, was part of what they were thinking?
No, at this point, the majority of them are former lawyers, so they know what they're doing.
Right.
What is it with lawyers going into then writing fiction?
Romance.
Romance.
Wasn't she?
Stacey too, yes.
Stacey Abrams.
Yeah.
And she also appeared as the president of the world on Star Trek Discovery.
But I'm curious, what made you think to ask the question? What were you thinking about there? Because you must have seen a little bit of a red flag or some concerns.
No, I just, my senior work is in romance.
Uh-huh.
So it's
Interesting.
something that I paid attention to.
Yeah.
So here's a question. Sorry, Ryan.
No, please. Yeah, go ahead.
An interesting question for you, and the people who are working in this entertainment media effects area argue that certain genres have lessons built in that, regardless of what story,
Yeah.
are there political lessons in the genre of romance that pop up again and again?
Yes. It's also, the ending is always the same. It's a happily ever after. The couple gets together one way or another through marriage. You're like, you're my boyfriend or whatever.
That's actually politically damaging in a way you might not expect. Go ahead.
Well, so they were organizing on giving democracy a happily ever after. And I think that, and also because romance is one of, Bell Hooks says that it's one of the few places where women can talk about love openly. It addresses like miscarrying and abortion very frequently and very frankly in ways that aren't common in mainstream media. And,
that's awesome.
It's also reacting to politics and or economic climate all the time. You wonder why 50 Shades of Grey was so popular, but there was a recession at the time. Like, billionaire romance became very popular during that time period because of the idea that like the fantasy that wouldn't it be nice to be taken care of. The reality does not matter, my work in particular is dealing with Vietnam vets in category romance publishing, which is a specific area of it in the 1980s. So that's
interesting.
what I
No, that's awesome.
The other thing you're saying is that the soap operas have a long tradition of, social activism.
Mhm.
Yeah.
These women writers who were, putting the first gay characters when they were looking at AIDS, and it's an amazing kind of art form.
Yeah, even while the happily ever might be politically damaging, they're doing more work in their books than just promise in the marriage.
And
One is I'm curious.
So,
dangerous.
another piece of research I did was on the effects of the series Game of Thrones and House of Cards. So it's interesting because
Peter Dinklage is an alum, by the way.
awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. That was a great series until the end. As everyone probably will say, right?
It's dragon, like what did people think was gonna happen?
Anyway, there's a concept in psychology, it's a notion that people differ with regard to their belief that the world's just or not. And research has shown that if you believe the world is just, that you're less likely, that is, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. You're less likely to support government programs to address issues in society where people have been victimized by, the society and are unemployed or in poverty or, a whole host of other issues in our society. So if you believe the world's just, you're going to be less likely to support an active, progressive or liberal government policy to help out people who have fallen on hard times. All right. So if you think about all of our stories, and in fact, just the norm of telling stories, nobody wants to watch or read a story that doesn't have a happy ending. It's a downer, right? And so most of our stories really have that fairy tale or happy ending, narrative, or what's the term? Yeah, I'll just leave it at narrative for right now. And a scholar in Europe actually looked at that in terms of, the programming, fictional programming, and compared, did this study where he compared people watching the news to watching, fictional stories, and found that, those who watched a lot, and I think it might have been an experimental study too, those who watched a lot of entertainment media were more likely to believe in a just world, which then leads to a conservative outcome. And so with Game of Thrones, when that started up, and if you don't know the show, it is brutally unjust. If the minute you identify or like a good character, they're dead, they're gone, and the most ruthless, disgusting characters succeed in the series. So for the first 4 seasons, the lesson was the world is not just. And the interesting thing about that is, in the genre of fantasy, is like you kept, fantasy, of course, people, they go through bad times, Frodo and Sam, struggle, whatever. But it's the turnaround's much more quick on the happy ending, or things go right for the heroes. But that wasn't happening in Game of Thrones, all right? You had Ned Stark, honorable, good guy, first season. Sorry, spoilers. Second season, you have his son, who's king of the north, and then you have the Red Wedding, which I, gave people nightmares in terms of how brutal that was, and so on down the line. All right. So what I thought, and I was working with students on this time, I had done a work on the belief in a just world as a grad student, and it's like, whoa, that's what this show is doing. It's really turning that script on its head, and it's kind of saying, look how it's kind of like the news, the reality, if you would. It's like how unjust the world is. So I did a series of studies, some surveys, some experiments this time to try to get at the causality. And we found plenty of evidence suggests people who were exposed to Game of Thrones had a lower level in belief in a just world than those who weren't exposed to Game of Thrones. So it kind of, that's where that happy ending, if you think about it, for constantly everything works out okay, then why do we need government to do anything to try to fix the problems? Why do we need, as citizens, to do anything to fix the problems? And so it's kind of that meta message of our storytelling that has a real interesting political effect that people aren't really aware of.
Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you feel an effective policy response to polluted information would be.
To what?
Polluted information.
Environment, yes.
I think that it can seem like a particularly overwhelming issue, given that now I think thinking particularly of the conservative movement, they've built an alternative media ecosystem. So apart from even major media platforms or companies, they can kind of make their own think tanks and have advocacy networks to kind of disseminate that information. How do you sort of approach regulating that? Is there an effective way to intervene, and what, in your opinion, would that be?
And you said polluted information, right?
Yeah. So
Polluted, yeah, I'd call the information environment
Yeah.
polluted, toxic mix of cynicism and sensational and misinformation, disinformation.
Ideas that could be done.
How can it be fixed?
Yeah.
That's a great question. Like I say, I haven't gotten there yet. But no, I've been struggling with this for a long time. I wrote about it in my last book on American elections. And in talking to students, you know, we get to the point, last time I taught my media class, it was all about media and democracy. In the end, it's like, well, what can be done? How can we fix it? How can we regulate all the disinformation that's out there? How can we make discourse more civil and more full of meaningful content that helps citizens in their duty as citizens in a democracy? At this point, it's not a satisfying answer, but it's an answer that Neil Postman settled on. And that it's really, given where things are, there's no taking the stuff back. There's, like when he wrote, you can't get rid of television. You can't blow up the TVs. It's just not going to work. Where we're at now, you can't get rid of social media. You can't even really regulate them to the extent that needs to be regulated, because you ultimately are going to get into a territory with disinformation that if you follow politics, you know how people slip in misinformation. You know, it's like, well, I was just posing a question. I didn't assert this. So how do you control that kind of thing? And so from a kind of top down or a kind of regulatory approach, that's problematic. So two things. One is, and this is Postman's solution, that it really resides, the answer resides in us and education of the public to be aware of what information is and the various forms information takes, and what is good information and what isn't. And it's something we strive, Brian and I were talking about this, to teach our students. You get messages, how do you evaluate those messages? How do you evaluate the claims that exist in those messages and those arguments? And if you can develop a set of skills and a standard of evidence, and also an awareness of the way things play out in our media, like being distracted by trivia, just the silly nonsensical things that our media tends to run off and make big issues about, that oftentimes are not proportional in any way to their importance. That if you develop those skills, that's the best defense, is the citizenry who will not fall to those sort of things. And that's not a completely satisfactory answer. You obviously need to build that into your education system. And we have been doing that. There are media literacy courses that strive to do those sort of things. So we do have those components.
But we don't do it, interesting enough, sorry to interrupt, we haven't done it in our, like the Vermont standards have not adopted. So we think about it, I think, as something to almost, and I could be wrong, wait until college to get there.
And then it's too late.
And then it's too late. So would you recommend that Vermont start saying, all right, this has to be embedded, you have to have algebra 3, and you also have to, as a middle school or high school, to have some kind of curriculum, some kind of experience.
If we want our democracy to survive, I do think
really
we
do.
have to go there. So I see some legislation.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Sure.
I totally agree about media literacy. At New Public Radio, we did on the media show.
That is an awesome show. I do believe,
I mean, what else?
what's her
can we
name
say?
is
She's sitting right here.
political science grad. Yeah, sorry.
Anyway, Neil Postman wrote that before me.
Yeah.
And that was when I think media literacy could have been, might have solved a lot. I think you have to have regulation. I think you gotta like do what Twitter is doing and kick Trump off, and you have to have much more regulation. That's my view.
But
and that having run a bunch of broadcast channels, knowing what the FCC does in the broadcast world, I think there needs to be something akin to that. It's hard to go back, but we've got to do this, or our democracy isn't.
well, that's my other answer. My other part of the answer. I am not complete agreement with that, just because all the new social media organizations that have popped up that don't regulate. There's actually a piece in the Pew Research Center on their website that just came out today on that. But it's funny, when I testify, I actually in my campaign finance research days, I was hired by the state to defend the state's campaign finance laws and testified in federal court defending the campaign finance laws that were passed at the end of the 20th century. And you know, the people who oppose campaign finance regulation would often say the solution to pollution is dilution. And that is the idea that, all right, we got all this, we have this toxic flow going into our information environment. Well, we really can't choke that off given how things are. We can do some of that, but we're never going to completely block it. So try to bolster the sources of good information to flow in and kind of try to dilute that pollution with more good information. So things such as, you know, in Congress, there's a bill to help local newspapers hire journalists, and local newspapers are so important. And nobody reads them. You guys reading your local? What is the Bennington Banner down here still?
But Vermont Diggers.
Yeah, because it's online, and it's a great organization.
Banners online.
I read the, you know, Montpelier Times Argus, but you know, hiring journalists starting at that level and trying to support nonprofit media organizations. You know, ProPublica does a really good job of investing a lot of money into investigative journalism. That is, in other words, is like, is there, you know, think of these programs that could provide financial support to, in essence, bolster journalism and journalists and kind of balance out that, you know, the media organizations' incentives that overwhelm journalists in our environment. And part of media literacy is also teaching individuals the difference between a pundit and a journalist, an online person, an on-air personality and a journalist, and what it really means to produce good journalism and what the methodology is behind it to try to get at the truth or accurate portrayal of reality.
And is there a role for higher education, for college newspapers, things like that? I mean, I'm
Yeah,
curious, does UVM have something that competes it? I don't know.
Richard Watts at UVM has put together a great little program of, sorry, little sounds like I seriously think it's a great program where he's having students intern at media organizations as a way to bolster the journalistic workforce to a certain degree. It's almost like my VLRS attempt to help the legislature with its staffing. And so there are programs like that would be good, but they also need to have the training. They can't just be thrown into those internships without some sort of training and some sort of substantive knowledge too. So,
but does UVM have a newspaper online that somebody might from the community of Burlington go to sort of take a look to see, compared to like the Burlington Free, you know, might?
Well, I imagine 7 Days has a lot more cachet than the Free Press, which is owned by Gannett News and decimated. I mean, they got rid of their top journalists, long-term journalists who really knew politics. And, you know, one of the things you have to think about is what the training and background of journalists and what they bring to those interviews that they have with politicians. If they don't have any background, substantive knowledge, politicians just can, sorry, I'm adding to that cynicism about politicians, but public officials can manipulate them and make it, and if they're not asking the tough questions, and if they haven't done their research, longtime news producer for WCAX, a guy named Marsalis, my coffee's got me sped up. Marsalis Parsons. He was probably the most trusted news person in Vermont for a long time. WCAX News came to my media class every single year. He was great. And students will say, well, what should I do to become a journalist? And he would say, don't go to journalism school. He would say, study a subject and become an expert in it. And that way, and you know, because we can teach you how to interview and produce a video piece, or for print, how to write a good piece, is that substantive background, that expertise. And the way local television news and some local media outlets have moved is to make their journalists generalists who don't develop any expertise. They're not covering the State House regularly. They're not covering City Hall regularly. They don't have the beats, and so they don't have that built up expertise or knowledge that then makes,
Connections,
yeah,
guess,
or connections,
right, yeah.
and makes what they produce less substantive and less of value to the citizens.
Because you do get a connection with journalists as
Oh,
a
yeah.
politician all the time.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess, this is more of that, we talked about the Harry Potter thing with millennials and like, authority, so I guess I was wondering if there's like, you looked at like left wing anti-authority stuff, but did you also look at like right wing, because.
Oh, no, it covered both.
You looked at both, so how do you like analyze the anti-authority stuff? I mean, out of that book, we find two different messages of like January 6th being very different than the like left wing anti-authority, like how did you look at that?
We didn't look, well, the book was published back in 2013. Wow, thank you.
The good group.
Very good. I'm also incredibly flattered. So we didn't look at sort of that aspect, but the people who are involved in January 6th, those are authoritarian types. They are following Donald Trump and his big lie, and incited by his lie about the election to interfere with the democratic process. So those aren't Democrats, lowercase d. Those are authoritarians. Those would not be Harry Potter fans, basically, in terms of the types of individuals. So does that make sense?
I guess I was wondering, because a lot of there's the stuff that within that group of January 6th people could be categorized as anti-authority because they question the process of a lot of things.
Well,
that they work. But that's why I was wondering, like, how do you look at that?
They do have the rhetoric of democracy behind their, basically, so they want freedom, obviously a democratic value we all want, challenging authority. But there's challenging authority based upon some real evidence that you have, as opposed to just following a leader who is telling you this and not providing you with any evidence to support those claims. So they're all about just following Trump. They're not willing to actually challenge and look for, okay, is there really real evidence behind these claims that are being made about the election being stolen? And if they're presented with the evidence, they just dismiss it all as fake news. 60 court cases and judges, including many of whom were appointed by Republicans, and Trump himself, who said there were no merits to their case. The Arizona Senate Republican recount to the ballot that showed that Joe Biden won. All of the evidence. Liz Cheney, all the, what's his name? The attorney general who quit at the end of the Trump administration, all those Republican officials saying, look, there's no evidence. The Secretary of State of Georgia standing up to Donald Trump, and the governor of Georgia and the governor of Arizona, all Republicans. But they listened to one person and one person alone, and that is the sign of authoritarianism. They're not questioning Donald Trump. They're not questioning all of the information built up around, not information, alternative facts built up around that big lie to motivate them to try and block the democratic process. So that's why, they will use the terms of democracy to sort of cover up what they are doing, but what they are doing is incredibly anti-democratic, denying the results of the popular and fair and free election, where there's absolutely no evidence suggests that it wasn't that.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was trying to get to, those very different forms of anti-authoritarian beliefs, like one being evidence being real or not. And I guess I was wondering, like, if there's media influences on the different camps, like the same way with like skepticism and cynicism that you're talking about before.
So authoritarianism is a little different. Authoritarianism is more than just your orientation towards a particular authority figure. It kind of goes deeper than that in terms of sort of how you see the world and the proper role for individuals in the world. I wish I had one of my books here to sort of like read out the definition of it. Sorry, I feel like.
That's okay.
Uh, but authoritarianism is a predisposition to follow authority to the point of doing things, discriminating against outgroups, creating in-groups in society, attacking people who don't conform with what is seen as the norms of society. Those are kind of the key aspects of it. It's funny because I just wrote a definition of it in my
Can you
recent
maybe
book.
give an example of left-wing authoritarianism?
Left-wing authoritarians would be, individuals who are willing to sacrifice democracy, like the results of an election, for their more liberal or left-wing kind of beliefs. It's kind of putting your goals above the process, if you would, ends above the means in a certain way. But also methods of attacking those with whom you don't agree with if they're not conforming, insisting that everybody goes along with the group, and any of those who don't conform with the group's views are ostracized or attacked or expelled from the group. So I'm sure you've seen that on the left as well as that happens on the right.
So would
Okay.
you, like the plague of like cancel culture, would that, like some of those examples might fall under left-wing authoritarianism?
Yeah, I kind of hesitate going on that in terms of it. Now, I haven't dug that deeply into that aspect of what's been going on in cancel culture, because there's certainly some good justification. There's justifications for what's happening there. But I guess if you're like to try to defend somebody, there's the attack of cancel culture, and then you become ostracized. That would be, I guess, a case of, you're not allowing any sort of rational discourse. You're just like, boom, like a litmus test, and that's it. So I guess to a certain degree, depending on how extreme it gets.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with your idea on education being the way to solve this issue of analyzing sources and understanding your local beliefs in this. But given that I feel like America tends to have this sort of very negative opinion when we try to change our education systems, the whole issue of the critical race being taught in public schools, and that was misinformed and overflowed up, in my opinion, that a lot of news media are creating this narrative story about is a major right-wing point.
Yeah.
So how can we attempt to have this conversation and bring up the idea of we're not forcing certain ideas, we're just trying to make yourself more aware? How can you have that communication without someone getting
And what's giving
That we're just grooming liberals for
Yeah.
the future,
Yeah,
right?
Great question.
That's an awesome question. I don't know if I have an answer for that one. I'll have to struggle with that as I write this book, but yeah.
I think it will be as controversial as, some other things that we've attempted in education policy.
Well, if the authoritarians in society see it as a way as affecting their power, they will oppose it no matter what. So the question is, can you frame it in a way that you can get it under the radar? As soon as they realize what's happening, they'll, because, and in writing this book, I'm starting off our stated democracy. It's like, people are going to just think this is all biased, but this is all about an assault on democracy, and one party is doing it right now. And it's not about the ideology or the policies of the party. It's about their stance towards democracy, their authoritarianism, if you would, and their assault on democratic institutions. I don't know. I guess it depends what because you're gonna have the older generation that you can't reach through that education, or you're going to try to interfere with what education is going to do to try to transform society. So that's a huge problem.
If it's something you want to interested in, then I should have a conversation about it. Yeah. No, it's
Do you have any ideas?
That's kind of why I asked.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, a lot of these problems are, this situation right now, I don't know where we'll be in a couple of months as a democracy. And especially in, after the presidential election, things could turn around dramatically. And And if they do, and if the Republicans find that supporting authoritarian leaders and playing to the authoritarian part of their party doesn't work for them, then maybe they will change, but we'll have to see how that plays out. The environment's just, the political environment is just going to change dramatically in the next several years. We don't really know what's going to happen. But we do know what they're doing to try to affect it, like all of the local election officials that the Trump organization is, filling spots with people who are election deniers and who are more than happy to overturn, election results to support their side, basically. We have candidates running for Secretary of States, the main election officers in a lot of states that, our election deniers believe Trump won the 2020 election. I guess the issue of how do we convince at the education level, I guess just we have to defend our education institutions, I guess, as institutions that teach individuals how to think in a way that they can find and evaluate information and develop standards of evidence to equip themselves, understand logic and reason, and understand what is irrational arguments, understand and identify conspiracy theories and why they're problematic. If we can do that, and that is what high school teachers do. A lot of them, their goals are as well. If we just keep working on that aspect of our mission as educators, we can just hope to transform future generations, perhaps.
Are other democracies in the world, I suspect you're looking at,
I'm not,
Canadians, British, are they having these, we know what's happening in some of those countries politically, but are they kind of having the same struggles we are with the media?
With the media, I do put,
As it relates to democracy, as it relates to threatening their.
They do, and some of it in large part is due to the spread of our media and our media technology. Or used to be we thought we were exporters of democracy, but we seem to be with our media. We're exporting all these horrible habits that could lead to the downfall of media, including Postman's argument about television. An interesting thing about how television was operated in other countries that was different from the United States is that when broadcast media first came on the scene, governments had to decide, right? These broadcast organizations are using airwaves, public airwaves. Do we give over to private industry the rights to use those airwaves? Or do we say they're public airwaves and we create media to broadcast through those? So the British Broadcasting Corporation or the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation are, they were the ones originally on the scene and doing the television programming then. And you can see just in the BBC, the values have carried through in their news from that time. Whereas we went to the business, give it to private organizations. At first, we had this public service requirement in our law that required that media organizations that were given these free resources, the broadcast spectrum, that they had to provide a public service. And the way the broadcast television and radio stations did, they created news programs for that. And they even ran those news programs at a loss, a financial loss, because it was part of their public service. But the advent the Reagan administration and the decision not to push the public service requirement, plus the advent of cable and the heightened competition in media and the buyout of the networks by larger corporations, all meant that suddenly their bosses said, no, news organization, the news bureau has to make a profit as well as the entertainment side. And that totally made it so that our news became what Postman argued. It's just entertainment. Why else do you hire John Williams to do the music for the NBC Evening News? It's an entertainment program. It is pure and simple, an entertainment program. And it's driven by entertainment values.
Susan?
Sorry.
No, I was actually gonna relate to that, to tie it back again. If the entertainment is so powerful a draw, And you were even saying that, you know, Game of Thrones or the romance, not, it's like these are teaching or influencing politically more than we imagine. And that in some ways is our education, rather than being in a school.
Or rather than getting the information from news accounts or good
Right, or from
journalism.
right.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm asking then is what if we can't go back? Right? Like you're
Yeah.
saying, we're really in a big mess and we can't go back. We have to deal with the mess we're in. Is there some way to think about like the arts, like playwriting or all these, like the narratives, the storytelling, everything that we are engaged in our lives that is really influencing us and influencing us negatively as
Mhm.
well, right? With the misinformation, disinformation. So is there a way to powerfully counter the misinformation and disinformation with like artistic expression that is truly powerful, engaging, that really will do these things that you're studying? You know what I mean? Because it does seem more like about what the present moment is, as opposed to going, well, we wish we could be more rational. We wish we could have these policy debates so that people would pay attention. But are they? In this world, in the social media world we're in, I just don't know if we're going to shift back to something, or if we actually have to move forward into some other space where the good, like the evidence, is embedded in maybe the entertainment. I don't, you know, anyway.
Well, you know, the education component, the, flooding the environment with better information by supporting it. And then on the entertainment end, there's a lot of good stuff out there that in subtle ways, I've always kind of been skeptical and cynical about Disney, but having a teenage boy means I watch an awful lot of the MCU. And the TV series that they've produced with the lead Muslim character, whether Captain America can be a Black American, it blows me away that they are actually taking on some of these issues kind of head on. The area you run into problem is then who kind of controls that messaging and says what should be message, and that's where that could fall in the hands of undesirable forces, the authoritarians, the anti-democrats, as well as those who are democratic. So I think we have to leave the arts to itself. And I do think my sense over the years is, and I'm no expert in this, but that those values are out there and they show up in a lot of entertainment in a lot of subtle ways that could have a positive effect, if you would. Right now, the divided society we have and people, entitled to their own facts. I'm thinking about, God, maybe I should be writing a novel that, really kind of puts it in a very subtle way, the dangers of where we're heading. Although we've had that. I mean, now examples are escaping me, but obviously, and I think she's speaking at UVM tonight, Margaret Atwood's work. Although there's a bit of self-selection going into those pieces. But that's where things like the Marvel Universe, Star Wars, all those really popular ones, that if you can start to, if there are some positive messages in there, that maybe they can have some sort of impact. Laura?
So just thinking up on that question. Last year I sat about a mile or two away from here with Marlon Lear, who is 99 years old. He has a house here in Vermont, and talked about this question of.
He did it.
He did
Bigotry, on bigotry.
On bigotry, all in the family. It was all, he had an intention to change values, to change minds, to story. I also, dedicated a lot of my time at Untitled Radio to creating radio stories that were stories, but fact-based and also trying to get a point across. And, so Radio Lab kind of talking about kittens to get you into the Supreme Court piece. Because I do think it's not necessarily just our emotion or facts, It's
about a
it-
narrative.
It's about a narrative. But my question for you is, if you look back at journalism in the last century, clearly newspapers, back in the early 20th century were very partisan and very, they were actually in some ways worse. In some ways
That was the
than-
birth of newspapers, were
Yeah,
partisan
they were
outlets
partisan,
before they figured they could make money off of them.
which they did. And then you get this kind of,
And actually, can I pause for a second? The norm of objective journalism comes from the idea that your paper's not going to make money if you're not perceived as being objective, because you're going to turn off half your audience.
right, so that's where I was going, was that what happened then? And then with broadcast journalism, it's kind of the same thing.
It just
But it's-
adopted
it's
that
the
model
sense-
initially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the sense of objective journalism, that there is kind of, on one hand, on the other hand, false equivalency. It's always kind of, there is such a thing, frankly, as objective journalism, which I don't think there is. I mean, I actually think, I studied at the feet of Gladstone,
Nice.
it's really about what's accurate, what's fair.
Yeah,
what's,
what comes closest to depicting reality?
Yes,
Yeah.
And, and I know when we were covering Trump at the beginning, people wouldn't say these are lies. You just wouldn't, because it was against journalistic kind of principle, And so when you look at it today, as you've got kind of journalism and you've got pundits, and you've got people like Trump, you have to call out the lies. You have to call out the inaccuracies. And then when you do, as a journalist, you often seem like you're not being.
That's because people have a, yeah.
So I'm just curious where you see journalism in that sense going.
That's a great point. And in talking about that, journalists had a hard time adapting to this change in our political discourse that is best illustrated by Trump now with the lies, but it goes back decades. I mean, they really handled George W. Bush in a way that he issued an awful lot of lies, and they didn't call him on that. So it was kind of more of a slow creep. It wasn't just Trump came on the scene. And I remember reading articles in the Columbia Journalism Review about, he said, she said journalism really is biased, actually, because you're giving both sides equal weight, but maybe they don't deserve equal, right? The meteorologist in Oregon who says climate change isn't happening should not be given as much weight as, the scientists who have studied this for their entire lives. So the future of journalism on that, and then this all ties into the cynicism of the public and their, this notion that, that the term bias, or sometimes fake news, whatever, is thrown around as just an easy way to dismiss an argument that you don't like. And that's another way we need to train our citizens to go beyond that. Sure, there may be bias, but what does that mean, and in what aspects of the argument or evidence we're actually biased, that needs to be worked out. And so that if the citizens understand what is and isn't biased, just because something is shown in a negative light doesn't mean it's biased. That may be what it deserves. If the economy is really, in the dumps, you got to say that, right? It's not all just a matter of how people feel or what they believe. There's some reality out there that we need to know as citizens, that journalists need to get as close of a read as possible on for us. And that may mean saying someone like Trump is an authoritarian who's anti-democratic, and that a lot of members of his party are as well, and they are endangering our democracy because, the Washington Post had an analysis today, and some people would say, oh, it was the Washington Post right away, right? That popped in your head, right? But look at their methods. Look at what they found. Look how they did this study. And they found that over half of the candidates up for U.S. House, U.S. Senate statewide races are election deniers and are willing to overturn an election because they lose, not because they actually have any real information to suggest that they won, right? So the public, that's another area in judging it, because that people dismiss, and then that self-selection in the fragmented media environment means people are going to their liberal media or their conservative media. And there are some, you know, liberal media on the far left, your left, that, you know, they're propaganda too. And you may really like to hear what they say and follow what they say, but you should really be questioning and thinking about how they are framing the issues, what they aren't talking about, all those sort of things to be a good skeptical individual. And they actually, some of those organizations attack the mainstream media, like the New York Times or Washington Post, as being conservatively biased. Okay. And he tried to get you to dismiss that so you can be their audience as opposed to following good journalism that you can find that's out there in a lot of other sources. Sorry.
No, this is great. So we have about 2 minutes left, and I think, you know, one of the things I think many of you are probably leaving with, which I'm leaving with at least, is what can we do around media literacy in those younger years? Are there things that we can do? What other advice? I mean, this is the Center for the Advancement of Public Action. What sort of things would you give this group to sort of go out and do as it relates to media?
So supporting journalism in ways that the money goes to journalists and not media organizations. But another way to think about this too, going back to my book on called Saving American Elections, about the problems with our electoral system, is that you know, right now we're in the middle of a storm or a hurricane, if you want, recent. And we really got to tend to the most urgent issues of trying to defend democracy, which means trying to get as many citizens out as possible to defeat the anti-democratic, with a lowercase d, anti-democratic, the party that is, you know, wants to establish a system that will not be democratic. And we currently have a system that, you know, the reason why they're having so much success right now is because our political system was so weakened up to this point. We have problems with campaign finance we haven't talked about, problems with redistricting, and of course, we've talked a lot about the problems of media as well. But our electoral structure, I mean, we do ask an awful lot of voters in our country, believe it or not, compared to how other electoral systems operate, where you go in and you vote for a party, and you know they're allocated seats in the parliament based on the percent of the vote they got, and you know what you're getting from the party. You're voting for the party based on a set of policies or an ideology. So, you know, weather the storm right now, and then think long term about really strengthening that electoral structure. Oh, the other thing is the administration of elections. We really need to focus on that. It may be, I don't want to be too cynical, but it may be too late in some respects about trying to encourage people to actually volunteer for those offices that actually run elections in our society, because that's handled at a local election, or a way to fund and support a more rational administration of elections in our system. So that's really important. We do it well here. And, you know, Vermont is an outlier in many ways, in many good ways. But we're part of a nation where these problems are real. And yeah, I guess.
Jack, I hope this is your first of many visits to Bennington College. This has really been terrific.
Thanks. I hope I didn't ramble on too much.
No, it's great. We have lemonade and cookies before you jump on the road. I'm sure there'll be people with questions, and maybe follow up if they have any by email as well.
Yeah, certainly.
Please, thank you very much, and let's give them up.
And thank you very much. Thanks for showing up, and thanks for your questions. One of the things, just one final comment, sorry. You know, I said, you know, like your comment is like, oh, I got to work that in the book. So I'm like, these conversations are really important for our scholarship as well. And one of the things I love about UVM is we have that model of really interacting with students and these kind of discussions that actually do help to inform our research. So thank you as well.
Great.